Good evening and welcome to ICAS Winter Symposium Veritas 2022. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS, and thank you for joining our program today. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Haass, on his special encore appearance today since the last ICAS Fall Symposium in 2018 at the committee room of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs. On today's virtual symposium, his particular focus will be on the U.S. leadership in Indo-Pacific and Northeast Asia in the 21st century. As a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and a leader of nonprofit institutions, Dr. Richard Haass is in his 19th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people to better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the U.S. and other countries. In 2013, Richard served as a chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, Richard received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State and was Principal Advisor to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and was responsible for policy planning staff as a Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Richard also served as U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one book on management, and his latest book is The World, A Brief Introduction, published by Penguin Press. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he lives in New York City. So Richard, we are so pleased and honored to have you back with our ICAS audience today. And ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoy the program, and let's welcome Dr. Richard Haass. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all. Again, I apologize for being a few minutes late. One would have thought after 2 years of living on Zoom, I would be better at it, but clearly not. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do this tonight. I'm happy to speak for a while. I'm happy to answer questions. How do we want to do this?
That's right. You can have about 10 to 15 minutes keynote remarks, then
Okay.
you'll be followed by Q&A.
Okay. I will keep my remarks short because I look at the screen and there's so much knowledge and experience on this screen that I'd rather hear from you than hear me. I know what I think. So I'm here to learn as well as to speak. So let me just say a few things. This is a really, really interesting time in both international relations and in American foreign policy. We're seeing several things happening at once, and I can't remember a time when so much happened at once. I want to begin with the geopolitical, but I'm going to return to that at the end. But we're obviously seeing a tremendous revival in geopolitical competition. I spend hours every day now dealing with the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. And it's but the latest example that Russia is, whatever else it is not a status quo power. Mr. Putin gets up in the morning and wants to overturn elements of the post-Cold War world, and he's willing and able to use military force and cyber and energy and other assets towards that end. And then obviously we have also the emergence of the geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And in both these cases, what's interesting to me is how wrong a lot of the experts were. The idea that in the post-Cold War world would somehow be a calmer, more settled place. It hasn't quite worked out that way. We can have the conversation as to why. And clearly the hopes that China, as it became more economically integrated in the world, would become more of a status quo country, that has not happened. So we have the challenges, very different kinds of challenges, just to be clear, from Russia and China. And as if that were not enough on the geopolitical side, you also have the geopolitical challenges of what you might call medium powers. You live next door to one, in the case of North Korea, but also in the United States and others are very much concerned with Iran, and not just its nuclear and missile programs, but its support of proxies and radicalism and terrorism throughout the Middle East. So again, this adds up to a very, very demanding geopolitical environment. Actually, I'll say what I was going to say at the end. I'll say it now. For the United States, this is a real problem, just in the narrow foreign policy sense, because the United States was obviously hoping to do a so-called pivot towards your part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, whatever you want to call it. But our ability to do so is, shall we say, significantly constrained by events. And right now, we're sending more forces to Europe, to Poland and other countries to deal with the challenge posed by Russia. That's the venue receiving the most of the president's attention and his senior staff's attention now. And our ability to leave the Middle East is limited by Iran and other challenges. So our goal might be one of strategic reorientation, but it's easier said than it is carried out. And one of the questions for us is, if we are not going to have the luxury of mostly focusing on one part of the world, either we're going to do less there, or we're going to have more resources. We are going to have to dramatically increase the resources that we dedicate to national security. And we have not had that debate yet. If you look at what we're spending now, as significant as it is, $750 billion in defense, and plus intelligence, plus diplomacy, it's still significantly below Cold War averages as a percentage of our economy, of our economic output. And the question is, are we willing and are we politically able? Is there consensus to do a lot more in national security? I'm not so sure, but that's a legitimate and it's a pressing question. Secondly, what makes this period of history so complicated is what's going on at the global level. And that could be, here we are, 2 years, we're about to mark, the end of the second year, beginning of the third year of the age of COVID-19. And we're still early on in the age of climate change, and the trajectory, shall we say, is worrisome in the extreme. And then we have the realities that cyberspace is unregulated. I've already alluded to proliferation. We may have regimes like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the reality is they don't have much effect. We have certain trade arrangements, but the World Trade Organization is significantly inadequate to the task, I would say. All sorts of things happening in the domain of digital assets and cryptocurrencies and the rest, and we're having trouble keeping up. So I would simply say we're living in an era in which global challenges, developments, technology, innovations are moving faster than diplomats can move. The challenges and the problems are growing and moving at a faster rate than our will and ability to contend with them. So there's a growing gap in all these areas, and the geopolitical rivalries make it more difficult for governments to collaborate and cooperate against them. So these two worlds, shall we say, collide every so often. And then thirdly, and I alluded to it a minute ago, all this is happening at a time of significant debate and division within my own country, within the United States. We had the extreme experience of just over a year ago in January of last year. But even today, the political divisions are significant in many, particularly on domestic issues. Interestingly enough, they're less significant on foreign policy issues. We're seeing a substantial agreement on how to deal with Russia. There's a fringe group on the far right, but basically most Republicans are supportive of President Biden on how he's dealing with Russia and Ukraine. There's a substantial agreement on how to deal with China. Not total, but substantial. The previous president signed an agreement to get out of Afghanistan. This president implemented it. I disagreed with them, but again, it suggests there was significant overlap. There's also overlap on the lack of interest in free trade. I mean, bipartisanship is always called for. It's not always good. We have bipartisan opposition to trade, and in my view, that's extremely unfortunate. But that's simply a fact of political life. I think there's a certain wariness about military interventions after Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're to some extent in this period where there's less of a consensus about our role in the world, and coming back to what I mentioned a few minutes ago about the priority to be given to national security. If you think about it, the previous administration talked about America first. This administration talks about Build Back Better. This administration is more internationally oriented, much more interested in working with allies, but the political priority is still domestic. And I think that is a fact of life. We saw that during COVID. We see it across the board. So I'll end where I began. We face an extremely demanding international environment, geopolitically as well as global issues. And I think the question is, will we have the domestic consensus in the United States to find the resources, design the policies, implement the policies that meet the challenge, either the geopolitical challenges or the global challenges. And I think, in your part of the world, I think there is a widespread, as I said, disposition. We saw it under the previous administration. We see it under this one to quote unquote pivot to Asia. The question will be to what extent we move beyond words and it actually becomes policies. And do we add a significant economic dimension? Do we add a significant military dimension? Do we add a significant diplomatic dimension? What I think we are seeing, though, is that is our inclination, and we see groups like AUKUS, we see the Quad, and so forth. So just like we're seeing a revival of NATO in Europe to deal with the challenge posed by Russia, I do think we're seeing a revival of an allied-centric multilateralism to deal with the challenges in the Indo-Pacific, which is, I think, good for many reasons, be it in terms of the sharing of burdens or the diplomatic or military or economic weight of joining forces. But that's where we are. It's, again, an extraordinarily demanding moment in history. And it's come at a time that the enthusiasm for continuing to play what I would call an outsized, a very large international role is not great in my country. But you don't always get to choose your historical moments. And this is the historical moment we find ourselves in. And I think the question is, how do we respond to it? And I think that's true of the United States. I think it's true of your own country and other countries in your part of the world. It's true of everyone right now. And to what extent do we manage the geopolitics? And to what extent are we willing and able to focus more of our resources and energies on dealing with some of the global challenges. Because again, what makes this era of history so different and difficult is that we have both familiar challenges in the realm of geopolitics and unfamiliar challenges in the realm of global issues. And it's the combination of the two that I would argue makes this such a difficult moment, all against the backdrop of our respective domestic politics. So that is my, why don't I stop there? And that's my attempt to set the stage.
Thank you, Richard. Patrick, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Richard. If you were Secretary of State and National Security Advisor like Henry Kissinger, and I wish you were, you have nonetheless described the circumstances in which we face 2022. We've lost primacy, basically, and the post-World War II system is no longer what it was. So in looking at the new Indo-Pacific strategy that our friend Kurt Campbell and others helped put together, it talks about, yes, that collective power with allies and partners, but it talks about, for instance, driving the economy. And that seems to be really one of the weak links here, because we may have $3 trillion a year in activity of trade and FDI in the region roughly, but are we really driving the economy? Can we drive the economy even collectively? What would you be doing that we're not doing?
Thank you.
Good to see you, Patrick. First of all, I think you're right that the articulation of a priority on the Indo-Pacific is farther along than the policy. It's true in every realm, diplomatically, militarily. I think it's probably most pronounced, though, as you say, in the economic. Our failure to join what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, is to me, I guess in football, in European, in soccer, we'd call it an own goal. We help negotiate it, and then at the last minute, we balk and we walk. The idea that China's now interested in getting in and we're not, that's enough to make your head spin. Can I just say that? And I don't see any easy way of turning that around. Now, what I would, if I were in a position of authority, which I'm not, I would make a run at it, and I would try to change the conversation. I would try to connect. I would try to make the case for trade, not just in the traditional ways of economic benefit for exporters and so forth, not simply to try to help those who are hurt by globalization. But I think that a big growing argument for trade is going to be environmental issues and climate issues. And the US, European, the EU steel agreement's a very interesting agreement, because we could basically try to create a zone, say, building on CPTPP, where climate-related concerns would affect your access to the zone. And if you built a product using coal, you would have to pay a certain, if you will, carbon tax or tariff to get into the zone. And the reason, I think that would be good climate policy, but also what I would try to do is change the conversation within the United States about trade, because we're stuck in a conversation that hasn't gone anywhere. If that didn't work, and it's possible it wouldn't, I think the idea of separating out digital trade is an idea that's worthwhile. I know that's a conversation that's getting more than a little conversation. I would have a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I would basically create some other individual free trade agreements, building on the one the United States and the ROK have, and so forth. So I would, if we couldn't do it in a big bite, if you will, with a regional trade agreement, then I would try to do it with some functional agreements and some country agreements. I'd also look for improving the WTO. I think we haven't put nearly as much emphasis on that as we should, but I don't argue your basic point. I think you're exactly right. It's the missing, if the proverbial stool has three legs, in this case, diplomatic, military, and economic, our stool, at best it has two, and even those two may not be fully complete.
Thank you. Dennis Halpin. Dennis?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. My question would be, going back 6 decades, there was great fear of a Sino-Soviet alliance in the Marxist communist era. People like Henry Kissinger worried about that. And then things like Damansky Island took place, and we realized they were in conflict. But with the recent visit of Putin to Beijing for the Olympics and the Chinese kind of indirect support for Putin's actions in the Ukraine, do you think the nightmare of the late 60s and 70s of a Sino-Russian alliance is finally coming to fruition? Thank you.
Look, it's a really good question. The Chinese behavior on Ukraine has been a disappointment after all these years, going back to the mid 50s to Bandung and all that. All these years of repeating the phrase of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, all the emphasis on sovereignty. Well, here's China's chance to put its principles into practice, and they're nowhere to be seen. And instead, you essentially get a support for rather unconditional support for Mr. Putin. Look, I think at the moment, the two governments have a kind of mariage de convenience. They're both authoritarian. They don't much like liberalism anywhere they see it, don't much like the United States. They each have their specific strategic desires for something of a sphere of influence. So the communique I saw, to use another American expression, was a bit of a, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. I don't think that's the same as an alliance, though. And even though now there are some complementarities, say, on the economic because of Russia's energy abundance and China's energy needs, I think there's ultimately limits in terms of their economic complementarity. There's all the territorial and demographic issues down the road. What worries me most is simply that the United States is less their active collaboration. So let me put it this way. I'm less worried about them being a formal alliance than I am about the reality that the United States now has difficult, to say the least, relations with both of them. And that's a real complication for our strategic planning, which I was getting at, that we increasingly have to think about the possibility of major strategic challenges in two theaters simultaneously. And I'm not suggesting that, that's imminent, but it's something that our planners have to take into account. And that's, for me, I used to work in the Pentagon. That's a demanding scenario. It always was, always will be. So I don't like the fact that we have extremely difficult relations with both. So Patrick asked before, if I were in a position of some authority, I would say this is less than ideal. And this is one of the reasons God invented diplomats. I'm not sure how many other reasons there were, but this is one of the reasons there are. And so the question would be, what do we do to improve our relations with one or the other, or ideally both? And I don't think that is beyond imagination. Now, that would involve some tough decisions. We'd have to think this through strategically and so forth. And I think we can do it without, and we should do it without compromising or sacrificing core interests. But I don't think we focused enough. So, for example, I'll give you one example. So to be very specific, I would say that I would not put as much emphasis on human rights or democracy type issues with China. Not that I don't care about human rights or democracy, obviously I do. But one, I don't think we're going to have much of any influence on China. And two, we have other strategic interests and issues with China where I think we can make some progress. So whether the previous administration here talked about overthrowing the Communist Party, this administration has its own preoccupations with China. I would simply say we don't have the luxury of doing that. That is not a smart use of American focus for American foreign policy. Again, not that these aren't important issues, but you've got to focus your calories, your resources on the most important things and where you think you can make a difference. So I think we need greater discipline. I think we've paid a price over the years for a lack of discipline in our relations with Russia and with the whole process of NATO enlargement. So we've got to carry out a more disciplined foreign policy, or we are going to find ourselves in a situation where we are going to have truly problematic relations with both major powers.
Thank you, Dunkirk. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me speak or ask a question. From my perspective, I happen to be in South Korea right now. Of course, I'm concerned about what we're going to do in Korea. We have a new ambassador coming here. I don't know when he's going to get approved, Philip Goldberg. But I wonder whether you think that we have any coherent policy for dealing with North Korea, or whether we should actually change policy. Maybe there's absolutely nothing we can do. Everybody has a theory and a suggestion and an idea, but I'm not sure there's anything we can do. Perhaps you have your own idea, which I'd be very much interested in hearing, and also what you think Goldberg should be asking and doing when he gets here. We don't know when that will be, but it'll be after there's a new president, by the way. There's an election coming up here on March 9th, in which the candidates have quite different views on how to deal with North Korea, incidentally. I'd just be interested in your assessment of that whole situation,
Sure.
or maybe I should say confrontation.
Well, two things. One is, I think, just an aside, the idea that we still don't have a new ambassador in place, what are we rushing for? I mean, we're only what, 30% of the way through the administration. We still got 70% of it left. So I mean, yeah, it is every once in a while head scratching. I would say the U.S. ambassador ought not to focus on North Korea. North Korea policy is going to be made out of Washington, D.C. And I would say a U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea ought to largely focus on U.S. relations with the Republic of Korea. Obviously, North Korea mention of that, but there's a million other things, from economic to trade to, we can talk about South Korea's participation in various strategic groupings like the Quad and so forth, formally or informally, about its how it thinks about Taiwan scenarios. There's a million things for the United States and South Korea to talk about. I would focus on that with all due respect. In terms of North Korea, this administration has knocked on the door of North Korea several times. No one's answered, as best I know. Like the old days when we had to go through Albania to deal with China. It's a difficult thing. So I would keep trying to do that. Look, I remember it was a comment by one of my first bosses, Harold Brown, when he was Secretary of Defense. And someone asked him about the United States and the Soviet Union and the arms race. And he said, look, all I know is this. When we build missiles, they build missiles. And when we don't build missiles, they build missiles. That's a little bit how I feel with North Korea. No matter how you design the negotiation, whether you go big, you go small, it's problematic. That said, I'm a believer in going small, what I would call a something for something approach. And even if you keep ambitious long-term goals, they're just that. They're ambitious long-term goals. I think what we need are practical short-term steps. And that involves almost not dissimilar from Iran, though North Korea and Iran are totally different places in their nuclear and missile programs. But you would basically, what do we have that they want? They want sanctions relief. Whether they have that we want constraints on their missile and nuclear programs. Okay, well, that's the basis of a conversation. And we're not going to get all for all. We're not going to get denuclearization and demissilization in exchange for a totally open economic relationship. So let's think more modestly. And let's think about smaller deals, step by step, with adequate monitoring and the like. But I would try that. And for a while, I thought that maybe COVID offered an opportunity with vaccines. I don't know the details of what was offered or not. Anyhow, that wasn't the breakthrough. I have no illusions about the difficulty. Anyone who speaks confidently about what should be tried with Pyongyang is not speaking from experience. I think we've got to be humble about it, but it's not like a good bottle of wine. If you put it in the basement and ignore it for 5 years, when you return to it, it's going to be better. So I would I would continue to work, and it's also another argument for a better relationship with China. We have to think about these things strategically, and though China doesn't have control over North Korea, it certainly has the potential to have more influence over it than anybody. And having a terrible U.S.-China relationship doesn't necessarily give you more to work with North Korea. But I would probably go public at some point. And they're doing missile tests. That's their equivalent. We used to call that station identification. That's the way North Korea reminds us they're still there. At some point, I think an administration figure should give a major speech after full consultation with Seoul and others, Tokyo, and put some things out there about statements about what we think a policy ought to be towards North Korea, ought to be totally coordinated, particularly with South Korea. But I don't think a vacuum, if you will, of policy is a good idea. So if we can't set something up yet privately, let's put something out there that's has some elements of attractiveness publicly.
If I may ask a quick follow-up, what about joint military exercises, which President Trump canceled after his June 2018 summit with Mr. Kim? And what about OPCON? How much should we press for OPCON, and how much should we press for conducting joint military exercises on the ground, which is what commanders want?
Look, the last I checked, the conventional military threat from the North is not diminished. I think you need to have a degree of, we've got to have readiness. So I would resume things. I would not do it as a shock. I would pass messages publicly and privately. I'd probably have a public speech first and put out a totality and in it and say we're going to do certain things. Last I checked, again, North Korea hasn't stopped missile testing. So we can and should do what we need to maintain deterrence, to maintain readiness. I'm not an expert on this anymore. I'm a few years, to say the least, away from it. And I think I would do it in a way that hopefully is not provocative. If I remember correctly, we had certain things we could, in terms of size, frequency, location. There are things we can do to reduce what might be the provocative nature. And I think we need to do those things. That's what deterrence requires.
Thank you. Tong Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Haass. It was a pleasure to listen to your views. And on North Korea, you give pretty much of what can be done. Something like exchange of a small thing for a small thing, gradual step, and so forth, many of which been viewed and also shared by many other experts as well. Now, it's been over a year since the Biden administration come into office, but nothing has happened, like you said, other than just last week, the foreign ministers from trilateral countries, United States, Japan, and South Korea met on Hawaii, and just to come up with the same old thing, that is, well, one thing was different. That was we don't have any hostile intent to North Korea, toward North Korea, which is good, which they had said at the beginning of the administration, not a year after. And then they were saying that we are open to diplomacy while we maintain a trilateral coordination and trilateral approach and strengthening, and open to unconditional dialogue, engagements, so forth. Could you elaborate on some specific advice or recommendations that you may have for the Biden administration, at least to slow down the speed of a North Korean advancing nuclear program, and also to reduce the terrible threat of North Korean provocations?
Well, one thing you alluded to already, which is unconditional dialogue. I'm a great believer in unconditional dialogues. I've never seen diplomacy as a favor. I see diplomacy as another instrument of national security. So I think we should be willing to talk, whether it's to Russia or North Korea or anybody, and you have those kinds of conversations with countries with whom you disagree. With allies, we call it consultations. It's different. So I'm happy to have those discussions anytime. I think it's, again, I would put we have to decide what the priorities are. If the priorities are the nuclear program and the missile, then I would not have all sorts of statements probably about human rights or other things. Again, you've got to choose your priorities. I deal with North Korea respectfully. I'd pass messages privately. I'd say certain things publicly. But I got to tell you, it's impossible for me or anyone to sit here and say, if we did everything I just said and probably some things I should have said, I can't sit here. I could not walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, if we do all these things, we'll get an answer or we'll get the answer we want. No, we just can't do that. Well, so I think all we can do is act reasonably. I think it's also really important, and that's why I thought this foreign ministers meeting was a good thing, that the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan stay on the same page. We do this we don't have to do everything together, but we've got to do it in a coordinated fashion. And other than that, I don't have any wisdom on this. Sorry. Here's the closest I come to wisdom. It's not very close, but here's the closest I come. I think there's two types of challenges you meet in life. There are problems and there are situations. And the good news about problems, at least in principle, problems can be solved. North Korea is not a problem. North Korea is a situation. At best, you are going to manage it. And I think that's the most we can hope for here. And so even modest things with North Korea turn to be ambitious. And so I would not be that's why I was not interested in the previous administrations, all the talk about denuclearization and big, grand bargains. That's not serious to me. That's theater. It's not going to happen. So I just think we have to think practically, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And even if we do everything right, I can't sit here and predict we're going to have much to show for it, to be honest. It's look, you don't need me to tell you. It's a unique actor, and history would suggest again modesty. But again, ignoring it's not a policy. Well, ignoring it is a policy. I don't think it's a wise policy.
Thank you. David Maxwell, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, and thank you, Dr. Haass, for your remarks. Let me just comment on a couple of your comments. I still think we need to take a human rights upfront approach. I don't think we should ever avoid human rights. I agree. We're not going to get changes in China or North Korea, but I think avoiding it in the hopes that it will lead to something else, I think, is not the right path to go down. And so I don't think we should ever ignore or neglect or avoid mentioning human rights. I think they need to be called out. Regarding exercises,
can I just come back to you? Just to be clear,
sure, yes.
I think we should avoid it. I don't think it should be a priority. I don't think we may decide we need to do it for normative reasons, for our own, to be true to our own values. Fine, but we should have no expectations it's going to have impact. And what I'm simply saying is we should not condition a rest of a relationship on it. And we should basically be willing, we should not be practicing linkage there with a country, I would say, like China or North Korea, simply because we have other priorities where I think history suggests we can make some progress. I don't think things are going to get better. Don't get me wrong. By ignoring it, I'm not suggesting, as I heard you say, that it's going to take care of itself and get better. I have no illusions about that. I have zero. It might well get worse. My point is simply, foreign policy has to be about the doable as well as the desirable, and that's where I'm coming from.
Yes, sir. I understand, and but I think there are 25 million Korean people in the North who are suffering. That we owe it to them. We have a moral obligation, and I think it's a national security issue because Kim Jong-un has to deny the human rights of the Korean people in order to survive, and I think that's a part of his deliberate strategy for survival. But I understand your point, and I would just add, I think Ronald Reagan provided us a pretty good model with the Soviet Union. Arms control on one hand, and he never failed to call out the Soviets on their human rights abuses. I think that provides a pretty good model. Tear down this wall is, I think is a good way to go. So on exercises, I'm glad to hear you say that we need to return to proper exercises to sustain readiness, because our number one national interest in the peninsula must be to deter war. So we need to maintain readiness for deterrence. I would I would say that the 4 dials that General Abrams had of scale, scope, and timing and the like, none of that causes Kim Jong-un to change his views. We should, I guess I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but we should never try to back down on exercises because it will have no difference. We need to maintain readiness and never sacrifice our readiness. If we have a single platoon training, North Korea is going to protest. But to my specific questions, you mentioned the Quad. The new Indo-Pacific strategy just came out from the White House. And one of the key lines of effort was strong trilateral cooperation between the ROC, Japan, and the U.S. And so my question is, do you think the ROC should formally join the Quad? And what do you think the prospects are of the U.S. Really generating that Japan-Korea cooperation that we really need to have effective diplomacy and security in the region?
Well, the biggest problem with South Korea joining the Quad is, what do you call it? The Pentagon's already been used, so I think we have to think about the branding of this. Look, I think it's a natural. I think the question is how you get from here to there. One idea, again, is to think about it in terms of concrete steps. So instead of thinking that it's just an option. First of all, South Korea has to decide what it wants to do. And if South Korea wants to join it, great. Then I would say yes. A first step, though, might be certain association with it. Why not find certain areas where they can do some things together? So to get there, not in one step, but after some interaction. But the goal ought to be, yes, greater association, whether it's informal or formal. And as you correctly point out, dealing with the tensions or frictions or whatever the word is between the Republic of Korea and Japan is essential. And that's just gone on for way too long. And we could spend the next few hours talking about that. Don't need to with a group as informed as this one. But that's just one of those things. I understand. I have some appreciation of the intensity of these issues and the political dimensions of these issues. But this is, we've got, I'll use another American expression, we got big fish to fry. We have got to deal with some serious international challenges. So this is one of those times where you actually need some leadership and statesmanship on the part of both governments to put this behind them. There's been progress before, and then it's come undone. And so I don't think this is, shall we say, beyond the wit of man. I won't belabor or prolong our conversation about human rights. Again, I'm not saying to ignore them, but also you've got to ask yourself whether the preconditions that existed in the Soviet Union when Ronald Reagan did what he did exist in places like North Korea now, and I would say probably not. So anyhow, but to me, it's a question of, more than anything, of priority, and whether it's if progress in other areas are made conditional on it. I don't think we necessarily disagree on that. So I'm not saying it should not figure in the agenda. I just think that we've got to, how would I put it, right size it.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Larry.
Go ahead.
Taiwan has been mentioned only in passing.
Yeah.
Which I think is an oversight, to be frank with you. There are a number of analysts who believe that if Putin does use military force against Ukraine and succeeds, that this is going to encourage, and especially encourage, the military hardliners in the Chinese military and the Communist Party to urge Xi Jinping to move militarily against Taiwan. So I go back to the question, that statement that you made, that we need to talk to South Korea about what we would do in case of that scenario with regard to Taiwan. I think this is serious because I see a little bit in South Korean attitudes about the Taiwan issue, a little bit of the German attitudes that we have been dealing with difficulty now on Russia and Ukraine. So is it time to start talking a lot more seriously with South Korea about a military scenario on Taiwan and what the United States would want and expect South Korea to do if the United States should get involved militarily in helping with the defense of Taiwan?
Well, a couple things I'd say in response to that. I'm not sure what it means for Russia to succeed in Ukraine. It can succeed in going into the country and occupying it. I'm not sure it can translate that into a long-term position of influence. Could be very expensive. I'm also not predicting that Russia will go in a big way. We're not just going to stand by. We're obviously already doing some things. We would do other things. The one thing we're not going to do in the case of Ukraine, and I agree with this, is direct defense. In the case of Taiwan, I do think we should do and we would do direct defense. Very different situation, given our commitments there, and also given how our allies in the region view it. The allies in Europe do not want or expect us to provide direct defense to Ukraine. Our allies in this part of the world do. And I think Japan and Australia and others have made that clear. So I don't find the situations particularly analogous. I can't rule out that some people in China might not see them, either because of our not providing direct defense to Ukraine, or because that we've been forced to place more forces there. They may say this is a moment. China, though, is also much more economically integrated than is Russia with the world. So it's easier to inflict serious economic damage on China than it is on Russia, which is a much smaller economy, much more focused on energy and much more autarkical. Just as an aside, one thing I would do is I would make it a priority for U.S.-European relations to start talking to the Europeans, almost as we are talking to them now about what they would do if Russia moves against Ukraine. I think we should have the same conversation with the Europeans. What would they do if China begins to move against Taiwan? And I would love for the Europeans in advance to spell that out. I think that needs to become part of the deterrence strategy there. The single most important country with the defense of Taiwan besides ourselves is Japan. And I think there's been some really interesting evolution there. But yes, having South Korea involved in the conversation, absolutely. I've not thought it through militarily in terms of what sorts of things we would want. That would be the most significant in terms of you have to divide it probably between access to facilities opposed to things South Korea specifically did. And South Korea might be somewhat limited by the ability of the North to posture in certain ways. But I certainly think economically, as well as strategically, yeah, we should have that conversation. And it's one of the reasons that I look forward to a greater association of South Korea with some of the regional strategic developments that the Quad and AUKUS and other such things represent. But don't get me wrong, I'm the guy who's been basically arguing for strategic clarity about U.S. willingness to go to bat for Taiwan. So I'm on this, and I see this as a serious issue. I just want to basically focus on all the things we have to do, either declare or put into place or demonstrate. So those guys who go to Xi Jinping and say, "Hey, boss, now's our time to invade Taiwan," I don't want them to have a strong argument. I want the Chinese to basically, every time they look at it, to come away from it saying, wow, the costs and the risks are way too high. So we need to say and do all the things we can in order to increase the likelihood that every time China looks at the pros and cons of using force against Taiwan, they back off.
Brendan Malvani?
Great, thanks.
Go ahead.
I'd like to capitalize on that last comment and tie it back to what David Maxwell was talking about So you kind of commented on strengthening the alliance or the alliances. But what is something that we could be doing to strengthen the allies? And I love the fact that you reference, hey, not only do we have the Asian allies, but we have allies in Europe who could play a very important role. So what is something either through the alliance system or bilaterally, multilaterally that we could be doing to strengthen them specifically, not necessarily just to make the U.S. better, but just make them better?
Well, in the context of some of these contingencies, I think we've had a really interesting, case study in the last few weeks, which is American energy exports to Europe. And what we're basically saying is we are going to reduce one of the great strategic assets that Russia has been able to put into place, in part because the Europeans, particularly the Germans, unwisely did it, which is their dependence on it. So we ought to be looking, in the case of China, if we're talking about Taiwan scenarios, economic dependence on China and ways that we can reduce it. This is not decoupling, but this is a degree of strategic distancing. And we ought to be thinking now and taking steps to reduce China's ability to limit our willingness to inflict economic penalties on them if they were to move against Taiwan. So I think we have to look at critical dependencies. For the life of me, I do not understand why Taiwan has allowed itself to become so economically dependent on access to the mainland. It seems to me unbelievably short-sighted. And we have to look at some other countries too. And the United States has to look at what it's doing. But I think we need to look then at possible sharing arrangements, stockpiles, and domestic production. But we need to think this through. We don't want to be self-deterred from doing things simply because of dependencies. After that, I think it gets back to, I think it was Patrick's question about trade. Again, we ought to be building up economic linkages in this region. We ought to be raising barriers to Chinese entry. Basically tell the Chinese, you want to have access to these markets, great, but here's what it's going to take. And whether our agenda is climate related or strategically related, even human rights related, we can have that conversation. But we can only do that, though, if we have the kind of intimate cooperation, and we simply don't have it. And that's on us to a large degree.
Okay. Richard White.
Hi, Professor Haass, you made a really good, very insightful comments about Russia's policy overall towards being disruptive globally. But in the Korean Peninsula, that's not often been the case. In general, you've seen a good compartmentalization and cooperation in that. Do you anticipate this will continue, perhaps for Russian national interests, or do you worry about a spillover of the overall conflict into that region as well?
The honest answer is I don't know. And we've also, by the way, seen some Russian constructive behavior vis-a-vis Iran. So there has been a degree of what, if you will, compartmentalization. What I don't know if things deteriorate with Mr. Putin, whether he would stop that or even reverse it. I just don't know, as a way of trying to influence our policies on things he cares more about. And he obviously, he writes long essays of love letters to Ukraine. He doesn't do them quite about some of these other issues. So obviously what goes on, his Western border is of greater priority to him in his near abroad, and particularly his quote unquote European near abroad. So whether he would be willing to be or choose to be more difficult on some of these other issues like North Korea or Iran, I don't know. But as you say, we haven't seen signs of it yet. And presumably he's doing what he's doing in these other issues because they're in Russian self-interest. He's not doing them as favors to us. So presumably, or at least up to a point, he would continue doing that unless he was willing to risk lesser Russian interests there on behalf of what he sees as greater Russian interests in Europe. I can't rule that out, but that would probably be the calculation.
Robert Daly, are you there?
I am.
Go ahead.
Yep. Thank you for your remarks. You've mentioned blocking China's access to certain markets. You've mentioned strengthening Taiwan, strengthening alliances. But you've also said several times that it might be desirable to improve our relations with China. So my question is how? What do we want to consider? Do we have to consider giving something up? Do we have to be prepared to accommodate China in some ways? And is that doable politically, even if we saw strategic wisdom in doing that? So under all these circumstances that you've outlined, how do you improve relations with China?
Well, it's a good question. Well, certain things I would not like. I would, for example, continue to base the relationship on the one China policy. Here we are. In 2 weeks, we're going to mark the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. That'd be a pretty good opportunity to say something pretty positive about the Shanghai Communique and the one China policy, and make it clear that whatever it is we're thinking about with Taiwan in no way violates or is inconsistent with that. We're not, and reiterate all of our opposition to Taiwan independence, et cetera, and be more disciplined, by the way, about not allowing certain types of interactions between U.S. officials and Taiwan officials. We've, I think, at times been somewhat provocative, or I could use some other words, but I'll stick with that, in how we've allowed certain actions or interactions to go up. I don't think it's worth it. So that's one area. I'd be much more careful about our management of what's obviously a neuralgic issue for China. I already said I wouldn't do things like call for the, like Mike Pompeo did about the Communist Party. Let's have a traditional foreign policy relationship with China. Yeah, we can speak out on human rights where we need to, we should. But we ought not to make a goal to change the political system of China, to overthrow the Communist Party. Let's have a serious foreign policy. Let's sit down with China and deal with some of these regional issues. Let's not talk about decoupling economically, but we'll have some limited areas of strategic distancing, just like China, by the way, wants from us. They're tired of our sanctions. But let's figure out where we can maintain. There's lots of economic interaction that is not strategically significant. Why can't we do things on potentially certain areas of climate or health, and despite our many differences? Afghanistan ought to be something we can work on. Neither country, it seems to me, has an interest in seeing what's going on there, much less getting worse. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and this is going to be in some ways an extraordinarily difficult foreign policy task, because it's so much easier to conduct a foreign policy when it's a one personality relationship. This one has multiple dimensions. And so, and I would spend a lot more time working on it. I would have high level interactions with China much more frequent. What we call strategic dialogues are not strategic dialogues. Anytime you have 86 people in the room and all these bureaucracies represented, those are not strategic dialogues. We ought to have high level serious conversations with China on a regular basis. And whether it's Jake Sullivan or whoever it happens to be, it's not clear counterparts on the other side. President and Xi Jinping ought to have regular meetings, but we ought to invest the time in the relationship. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be uneven. But I would look for areas of limited cooperation, and I probably again wouldn't practice linkage. I would basically assume we're going to have areas of real friction and competition, but I wouldn't let those preclude our areas of limited cooperation, and I wouldn't poke sticks in China's eye because it makes us feel better.
Thank you. Nobuo Tanaka.
Thank you.
Right.
Dr. Haass, when I was elected the executive director of the International Energy Agency, you supported me a lot, and I thank you very much for that. And when I met Henry Kissinger before I was appointed to the executive director, he urged me to get China and India to the organization, because IEA is created facing the geopolitical challenge of energy security at the first oil crisis. And but he mentioned, because China and India will be the larger importer of oil already. So without them, the collaboration, the energy security or oil security cannot be really achieved. But he mentioned the second thing, why China should be, that is the climate change. because energy and climate change is the other part of the same coin. So without solution or a collaboration with China, climate change mitigation is impossible. So get China into IEA is what Henry Kissinger urged me to. Now India is asking the full membership to the IEA, even before China. So this, and the IEA's ministerial is focusing on that issue, and it's probably moving that direction. But China is not really interested in. So I think this is a great opportunity to get China into IEA and collaborate with energy security and climate change with OECD countries or developed countries. And that is the way to avoid China moving closer to Russia in the geopolitical current situation. So geopolitics, climate change, energy are very much related and complicated each other. So the role of IEA is very important now. And I think the US is pushing China into the IEA together with India. That is my suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nobuo.
It's good to hear from you. I haven't looked at it in years, so I don't feel particularly qualified. This is so I apologize. I would just simply say on climate, China's been a disappointment. And the issue is not US-Chinese collaboration. The issue is Chinese performance. And Chinese performance has been truly disappointing. And quite honestly, China hasn't made a priority about climate change. Its priority is still economic growth. And so it will fire up the coal plants at home in order to avoid unemployment or get more output. So China is not yet made climate change a priority. I'll put it bluntly. And that's not a question of their being in the IEA or anywhere else. That's a question of public policy. And for the moment, that's again one of the reasons I think we make an enormous mistake about not being a full participant in trade agreements, where we would then have the leverage to force certain decisions on China. And I would love for all Chinese goods trying to get into the CPTPP area to pay a carbon tax if China's building those goods with coal. That's not collaboration. That would be a way to incentivize China to do the right thing. That's what I want to see.
Dr. Altis?
I assume you're referring to my username, Dr. Artis08. This is Erwin Tan, Associate Professor at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. I've got a comment concerning the activities of Quad. And it seems to me the one concern I have about the quadrilateral security dialogue is that it might actually increase China's fears of strategic encirclement. In this sense, the historical parallel is how the Franco-Russian alliance aroused Germany's fears, hence the Schlieffen Plan in the July crisis of 1914. So in this present context, one concern I have is that further increases in the extent of the Quad's activities might portend a situation in which a US-led grouping can basically encircle China. Because if you think in terms of how China might feel more threatened through Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, that kind of encirclement might cause China to lash out rather than risk further encirclement.
I'm familiar with the argument and the historical parallel. The only problem with it, and it's a big problem, is that countries that claim encirclement tend to bring it on themselves. This is reactive. The Quad, AUKUS, many other things are happening. Why? Because of what China's doing. China has created an environment where there's now more criticism and fear and concern about China than there ever was. And we see it because of what China did in Hong Kong, what they're doing in the South China Sea, their military buildup, their pressure on the islands that are disputed with Japan. It's a long list. So yeah, there is now greater cooperation or collaboration among China's neighbors, but guess what? China has brought it about. And by the way, it's similar to what is happening in Europe now. NATO is having a new lease on life, not because the 30 countries suddenly rediscovered the importance of NATO, but Vladimir Putin has reminded them of the rationale for the alliance. So this is reactive. So I think it's important to react to countries like China or Russia when they build up capabilities and undertake certain actions that give reasons for concern. The idea that if we simply do nothing, that we will reassure them, well, we would do it, I think, by only a great risk to our own security.
Tom Kim, do you have a follow-up question?
Thank you, Dr. Haass. It was interesting listening to you, and I'm a fan of your pieces and your expertise on many areas, especially broader geopolitical challenges of the world today. Now, let me go back to North Korea one more time. That is, I think it is the right approach to start with a small thing for small things and gradual level. And some even argue that we may have to go back to Singapore Agreement 2018, at least where Kim Jong-un committed himself to a broad and nebulous expression of a complete denuclearization. And based on that, that is the basis of renewal of a conversation between, again, as far as North Korea is concerned, they're not concerned about South Korea or Japan or anyone else but the United States. And the United States is saying that we don't have any hostile intent to North Korea. They don't buy it because it's just a simply empty word as far as they are concerned. Now, there is an argument that we have to balance between deterrence and diplomacy. As you have discussed, while we maintain our strong deterrence so that should there be any emergency situation that we can cope with it militarily. So military option should never been taken off the table, but nevertheless, we should be more emphasis on the need to pursue diplomacy. Now, again, I like to hear more specific ideas for the Biden administration coming from you. What specific actions Biden administration can take it at this point?
So I don't really have much more to say, and you're much more expert than I am. I think, again, we should have a public as well as a private dimension to our diplomacy. We should be willing to approach it through various step-by-step or more ambitious things. We should put a degree of sanctions relief on the table. We should put humanitarian issues on the table. History suggests, again, modesty about what will work. Very hard to predict what might work. So I think we should be flexible in our approach. I think the most important thing is the United States and South Korea should be joined at the hip. There should be, we would say, no daylight between us on this. But I think we should be pretty, we should make clear our interest in this. And, I'm open to specific ideas. I just can't, I'm just not very optimistic. And in the meantime, North Korea is improving its missiles, increasing its nuclear inventory. So it's not as though they're standing still. So again, I think there's got to be a defense and there's got to be a diplomatic dimension to our response. But we shouldn't, I think, I think we got to keep our expectations quite in check here, quite modest, given the nature of North Korea and given the history. But I don't have any brilliant ideas here. And history would again suggest modesty.
Don Kirk?
After all these weeks about Ukraine and Taiwan and Korea, I wonder if you might comment or assess what China's doing in the South China Sea and on the borders with India, India's northern border, and in aid to Pakistan. We seem to have stuff going on all around the periphery of China. We haven't yet touched on those vital areas, so I'd be very much interested in your assessment of where we stand and what we should do. Thank you.
Well, I think the Pakistan is related to India. China and Pakistan have a strategic relationship. And in part, it's to keep India off balance. So China doesn't have to contend as much with a great power or medium-sized power in that direction. So I think it and Pakistan, shall we say, I remember the conversation I had with Imran Khan years ago here, where he wouldn't even begin to criticize China for its treatment of the Uyghurs because he didn't want to have any retribution about that would in any way reduce China's enormous support for Pakistan. So these countries are strategically aligned, and it's all about India, quite honestly. It is what it is. Ironically enough, even though I would argue that what Pakistan has done in Afghanistan may not be in China's long-term interest. Might not even be in Pakistan's long-term interest, what Pakistan has done in Afghanistan. But that's a conversation for another day, probably. But at the moment, they largely overlap because of their concerns, different concerns, but their concerns about India. South China Sea. Look, China has built up militarily for years. It's said it wouldn't militarize islands. It did. Look, it obviously has ambitions there. And they are not a status quo country. And diplomatically, as well as physically, they are out to take control there. The United States and others, shall we say, disagree. We don't have legal claims of our own. We just don't want it to be under China's purview. We want to have the right to have the kind of transit we want. This is just one of the areas where I think the world has to push back. But China's been quite determined, shall we say, in its desire to change literally the physical map of the South China Sea. And they've to some extent succeeded. They built up militarily significantly. But I think it's important that no one recognize their claims and their position be challenged. And I think my guess is, again, this is not something that's going to be resolved. This is just it's going to be a standoff for the indefinite future.
Well, how much support should we be giving to Vietnam in the South China Sea and also the Philippines?
I would give them
major countries bordering the South China Sea.
I would give them considerable support because again, we don't have a position other than that no country, not them, not China, should have unilateral control. So we're not favoring a position so much as we're opposing the Chinese position. And if Vietnam or Philippines articulated that equivalent position, we'd oppose that. And we would still do our transit. So I think we ought to continue our policy there and I would have regular transits. Sanju, I have to run.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Richard, this is great evening. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you all. Stay well.
Thank you, Richard.
Great conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.